In early 1943, the North African desert did not look like the place where a new army would be born. It was a harsh strip of Tunisia, broken by stony hills, dust-filled valleys, and a narrow mountain gap the maps called the Kasserine Pass. On paper, the Allied forces looked impressive. The British had already fought the Germans and Italians for years across the deserts of Egypt and Libya. The American army had arrived more recently, well-equipped, confident, and eager to prove itself in the Second World War. But paper strength and real battle were about to collide in that narrow cut in the mountains. The American formations holding the approaches to Kasserine were new to war against Germany. Many soldiers had never seen a German tank up close. Their commanders had read manuals, attended staff colleges, and studied old battles from Europe and the Great War, yet the enemy that approached Kasserine was led by veterans who had learned their lessons the hard way in Poland, France, and Russia. German units under the wider command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel moved with practiced coordination, blending tanks, artillery, and infantry into one continuous hammer blow. The Americans would feel that blow first in scattered reports, then in dust clouds on the horizon, and finally in the violent shock of contact. The defenses around the pass were not shaped by long experience. Units had been spread along a wide front, some dug into exposed forward positions, others too far back to support one another when trouble came. Communication lines were thin. Different branches of the American forces still thought in separate boxes. Infantry thought in terms of their own fields of fire. Tank crews waited for orders instead of hunting for opportunities. Artillery watched its own maps but did not yet control the battlefield with unified, concentrated fire. There was bravery everywhere, but it was bravery without a fully tested system behind it. When the German attack opened in February 1943, it did not arrive as a neat, predictable advance. It came as sudden thrusts through weak points, sharp probes backed by accurate artillery fire, and rapid exploitation once a gap appeared. German tanks pushed through narrow valleys and around flanks that had seemed secure on the map. Their artillery landed with unnerving precision. American outposts found themselves under fire from directions they had not expected, their lines of retreat cut faster than their commanders could react. In the chaos of those days, the weaknesses of the young American army became painfully clear. Units fell back without always knowing where neighboring units had gone. Field telephone lines were cut by shell fire, and radio discipline was uneven. Some commanders hesitated, afraid to commit reserves at the wrong moment. Others ordered counterattacks that went in piecemeal, without the weight of combined artillery and armor behind them. Tank destroyer units meant to hunt enemy armor were often scattered in small detachments, posted at road junctions or hilltops without mutual support, where they were picked off in detail. The terrain added its own cruelty. The Kasserine Pass and the country around it forced movement into predictable channels, and whoever controlled the high ground and the narrow routes could channel the fight. German forces used these advantages with skill, turning ridges into observation posts and valleys into killing grounds. American troops, still learning how to read this kind of battlefield, too often found themselves reacting instead of shaping the fight. Dust storms and smoke hid friendly lines as easily as enemy ones, making coordination even harder. Casualties mounted. By the time the fighting around Kasserine ended, roughly 6,500 Americans had been killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment lay abandoned in wadis and on slopes, burned-out vehicles marking the paths of failed attacks or hurried retreats. For soldiers who survived, the memory of those days would never fully fade. They had seen armored vehicles overrun positions that had felt secure. They had watched artillery barrages land with frightening timing. They had experienced the feeling of being outmatched not in courage, but in preparation, doctrine, and leadership. News of the defeat traveled quickly up the chain of command. Reports painted a hard picture. They described defensive positions poorly sighted, commands that had lost control of their units, and a system that had not yet learned how to make all its parts work together under the stress of a determined German assault. The shame was real, and so was the anger. This was the first major clash between American ground forces and the German army, and it had ended in a way no one in Washington or London had hoped to see. Yet inside that defeat were the raw materials of change. The chaos around Kasserine did more than reveal weaknesses. It showed exactly where those weaknesses lay. It showed which commanders froze, and which managed to improvise under fire. It showed how artillery could have turned the tide if it had been better organized. It showed how tank destroyers, when scattered, were too fragile, and when concentrated, could be dangerous. It highlighted every flaw in communication, every gap between theory and practice. As the guns around Kasserine fell silent and the lines stabilized deeper in Tunisia, senior leaders began to gather the facts. They looked past the simple label of defeat and started to examine the details. Who had held firm under pressure? Who had collapsed? Which procedures had failed? Which leadership habits had to be broken? The Americans had taken a heavy blow, but they had also been handed a clear, undeniable mirror. In that reflection, they could see exactly what needed to change if they wanted to stand again in North Africa, and later on the shores of Europe. In the days after Kasserine, while wounded were evacuated and units tried to reorganize, a different kind of battle quietly began. It was a struggle inside headquarters and command posts, inside the thinking of generals and staff officers. It was a contest between the comfort of excuses and the hard road of honest self-examination. The choice that followed would decide whether Kasserine Pass remained only a symbol of defeat or became the starting point of a rapid transformation that would reshape the American army before it faced the Germans again. The defeat at Kasserine did not stay in the desert. It rode home in official reports, in private letters, and in the quiet stories traded in mess tents and field hospitals. Senior officers could not ignore what had happened in that narrow pass. The Allied dream of an easy, clean campaign in Tunisia had been shattered by German armor and disciplined coordination. American forces had been pushed back, sometimes in confusion, and the cost in lives and equipment was now written in casualty lists and wrecked vehicles scattered across the hills. In a headquarters far from the dust and smoke, Dwight Eisenhower studied those reports with growing unease. As the overall Allied commander in North Africa, he carried responsibility for the performance of every unit that wore an American patch. The numbers alone told one part of the story. Thousands of casualties in just a few days of fighting. Positions abandoned in haste. Lines bent back to depths no one had forecast. Yet it was the patterns inside those facts that troubled him even more. Commanders who had lost touch with their units. Reserves committed too late or in the wrong direction. Supporting arms that had never truly been brought together into a single coordinated effort. Eisenhower had known from the start that this new American army would have to learn in combat. No amount of training back in the United States could fully prepare a force for the shock of facing German veterans. But Kasserine showed that the cost of learning might become unbearable if nothing changed. He could see that some officers in key positions were overwhelmed by the demands of modern warfare. They had built careers in a smaller peacetime army, where caution and routine were often rewarded. Now they were asked to manage fast-moving battlefields filled with tanks, aircraft, motorized infantry, and long-range artillery. Not all of them were equal to that task. The commander of the American Corps that had faced the Germans at Kasserine became a symbol of the problem. Lloyd Fredendall was brave and loyal, but his style of command had created distance rather than unity. He had chosen to position his main headquarters far to the rear, dug into a rocky defile that was difficult to reach and even harder to coordinate from. Orders filtered forward through layers of staff, often late and sometimes unclear. Subordinate commanders struggled to adapt rapidly when German attacks shifted direction. Eisenhower could not ignore the conclusion that began to form in his mind. The situation did not require kinder memos or firmer encouragement. It required a change in leadership. Allied political leaders were watching as well. British commanders, who had spent years fighting the Germans in the desert, had never been shy about doubting American readiness for a major ground role. They respected American industrial power and the flood of supplies crossing the ocean, but Kasserine seemed to confirm their fears about American battlefield experience. If Eisenhower did not act decisively, his authority and the reputation of American arms might suffer lasting damage. He needed to show that failure would not be explained away, and that the American army could correct itself faster than the enemy could exploit its weaknesses. The answer arrived in the person of George Patton. Patton was already known as a hard-driving armor leader, with a fierce belief in offensive action and strict discipline. Eisenhower chose him to take over the battered Second Corps in the wake of Kasserine. It was not a polite reshuffle. It was a clear signal that the period of gentle patience with unproven commanders was over. Units that had been shaken would now be led by a man whose very presence announced that standards were about to rise sharply. When Patton arrived to take command in early March 1943, the corps he inherited was still recovering. Units were scattered, some rebuilding after heavy losses, others trying to absorb replacements who had never seen combat. Equipment needed repair or replacement. The shock of defeat hung over the ranks like a physical weight. Yet beneath the fatigue there was also a stubborn core of determination. Soldiers who had faced German armor and survived wanted another chance, this time under leaders who would give them a better plan and clearer support. Patton did not spend long offering sympathy. He began with the visible details that shape daily military life, because he understood that those details reflect deeper attitudes. Uniform standards were enforced again. Salutes, discipline, and attention to orders were demanded, even in the dusty forward areas. To some this seemed harsh, even petty, when the enemy still sat just a few ridges away. But the purpose was simple. A corps that had been knocked backward needed to recover its sense of order and pride. Patton believed that a force that looked sharp would begin to think sharply, and that sloppy habits in camp translated into sloppy reactions in battle. Behind the scenes, the changes were even more important. Staff officers were told to rethink how they planned attacks and defenses. The old habits of placing units in tidy lines on a map were challenged. Patton insisted on positions that made sense on the ground, with mutually supporting fields of fire and clear lines of communication. He pushed for closer integration between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, even though the full doctrine for such coordination was still being written. He wanted each branch to stop thinking of itself as a separate tribe and start acting as part of a single striking force. Eisenhower supported these efforts from above by reshaping the broader command environment. He backed the removal of officers who had not performed well under fire, not as personal punishment, but as a necessary step to protect the lives of the soldiers they led. There was a new willingness to move promising younger officers into positions of real responsibility. Combat performance, not seniority on a promotion list, was becoming the main currency. This shift was painful in a service that had long valued rank and years of service, but the desert did not care about tradition. It only cared about who could adapt quickly enough to survive. In the days that followed, a kind of quiet urgency settled over the American positions in Tunisia. No one doubted that the Germans would test them again. Between the ridges and valleys where the previous battles had been fought, artillery crews practiced new drills, signal units worked to strengthen their networks, and staff officers refined plans that had to be better than the ones used at Kasserine. The clock was ticking. There were only a few weeks to turn the lessons of defeat into a new way of fighting before the next major clash. The transformation was not yet complete, but its outline had begun to emerge. A defeated corps had been given new leadership. An army that had discovered its weaknesses in the hardest possible way was starting to accept that honest self-criticism was not a shame, but a weapon. In the Tunisian hills, under the watchful eyes of both allies and enemies, American forces were moving through the first critical phase of a rapid evolution. The real test would come soon, when German armor rolled forward again and the new ideas, new leaders, and new discipline were forced to face the same danger that had broken them at Kasserine. Across the Tunisian front, the weeks after Kasserine carried a strange tension. The battlefield had quieted, yet no one felt safe. The ridgelines that framed the American positions looked calm from a distance, but every soldier who scanned them through binoculars knew they were temporary breathing spaces. German patrols still probed the valleys. Their artillery still tested the range and calibrations of American batteries. The silence was not peace. It was a countdown. Rebuilding an army in such an environment required more than new orders and new officers. It required a shift in mindset. American units had entered North Africa believing that courage, good equipment, and determination would carry them through their early battles. Now they understood that their enemy fought with refined systems, not simply strong will. To stand against that enemy, They would need their own systems, built through discipline, coordination, and relentless practice. Artillery officers became some of the busiest people on the front. Before Kasserine, American artillery had been powerful but uncoordinated. Batteries operated with skill but often in isolation. Now they began to train as a single organism. Fire direction centers were strengthened. Maps were updated with new reference points drawn from fresh aerial photographs. Observation posts on stony hills sent back precise adjustments. Units practiced what they called time-on-target missions, where shells fired from different batteries would land at the same instant on the same grid square. The goal was overwhelming impact, delivered without warning. It was a revolutionary step toward the kind of firepower that could break even the toughest armored thrust. Tank destroyer battalions underwent their own transformation. During Kasserine they had been scattered in small detachments, each tied to a particular sector. This had made them vulnerable, easy for German units to isolate and destroy. Now the doctrine shifted. Instead of being used as static guardians of road junctions, they were reorganized into concentrated mobile forces that could be sent rapidly to threatened points. Crews drilled in rapid movement, flexible deployment, and coordinated ambush tactics. Machines that had once waited passively were being shaped into hunters. Infantry formations worked to build cohesion under their new leadership. Officers walked the lines, studying the ground, repositioning foxholes, tightening defensive arcs, and ensuring that every platoon knew exactly which unit covered its flank. Patrols went out nightly to map terrain that had previously been only shapes on paper. The long slopes, dry riverbeds, and broken rock fields of Tunisia became better understood with each passing day. The American army was learning to read the desert rather than fear it. Supply and maintenance units, often overlooked in stories of battle, also played a critical role. The damage from Kasserine had exposed weaknesses in logistics just as painfully as the combat itself had exposed tactical flaws. Vehicles needed repair. Ammunition stocks had to be rebuilt. Replacement parts for tanks and half-tracks had to be moved forward along difficult roads. Under Patton's watch, the massive machinery of support began to run more smoothly. He understood that the next battle would not be won by courage alone. It would be won by an army whose weapons fired, whose vehicles moved, and whose supply lines remained intact no matter how fast the fighting shifted. Above all these efforts lay the pressure of time. Intelligence reports showed that German forces, though eventually doomed by the growing Allied presence in North Africa, were still capable of launching sharp, dangerous attacks. Their armored divisions remained among the best in the world, filled with experienced crews and aggressive leaders. The Americans could not assume that the enemy was weakening. They had to assume that the next test would be as hard as the last, perhaps harder. Inside headquarters tents lit by dim lamps, staff officers worked through long nights. They revised defensive plans, rehearsed counterattack options, and checked communication routes that would tie infantry, armor, and artillery into a unified reaction system. They had seen what happened when commands were slow or unclear. Now they were building layers of redundancy into their operations, ensuring that even if one network failed, another could carry the message. Each lesson had been paid for in lives, and no one intended to pay for the same lesson twice. The psychological landscape of the Corps changed as well. Soldiers no longer walked with the uneasy edge of humiliation. Instead, a colder, sharper determination began to settle in. They had been beaten once, but they had survived. They had seen what the Germans could do, and now they were shaping themselves into a force capable of meeting that challenge. The sting of defeat became fuel for improvement. Every drill, every inspection, every adjustment to a firing chart carried the memory of what had happened at Kasserine. This memory pushed them through fatigue, through doubts, through the lingering fear that the enemy across the ridges was simply better. As the weeks passed, the American positions began to look different. Trenches were deeper. Tanks were positioned with better fields of view. Artillery crews moved with the confidence of practiced rhythm. Signal wires were buried, protected from shell bursts. Supply convoys arrived on tighter schedules. Patrol reports became more detailed and reliable. The Corps was no longer simply recovering. It was evolving into something new. Observers from British units, once doubtful, noticed the change. They saw an army that had been shaken but not broken. An army that had chosen to learn at full speed rather than retreat inward. The British had taken years to refine their own desert warfare techniques. The Americans seemed to be compressing the same process into weeks. It was not perfect, but it was unmistakable. And then, as winter's chill softened into the early warmth of a Tunisian spring, signs began to appear that the quiet along the front was ending. German movement increased. Reconnaissance aircraft flew more frequently. Tracks in dry riverbeds pointed toward new staging areas. The enemy was preparing something. The Americans could not yet see the shape of the coming battle, but they felt it approaching like pressure in the air before a storm. The rebuilding was nearly done. The moment of truth was drawing closer. The force that had once stumbled at Kasserine was readying itself to meet the Germans again, this time with sharper tools, steadier leadership, and a hardened determination forged from the memory of defeat. They were waiting for the battle that would define whether their transformation had truly taken hold. The change inside the American Corps did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It grew day by day, in training grounds scraped out of the Tunisian soil, in command tents thick with cigarette smoke, and in endless sheets of map paper covered in pencil marks. The memory of Kasserine was still raw, but it was no longer just a wound. It had become a reference point, a fixed marker of what happened when a modern army went into battle without a fully developed method. Artillery was the first arm to show how different the future could look. Before Kasserine, batteries had fought bravely but separately. Each gun crew knew its own job, yet the larger pattern remained loose. Now officers began to talk in different terms. They no longer thought of a single battery supporting a single battalion. They thought of ring after ring of heavy fire, controlled from a central brain and able to strike any point on the front within minutes. Fire direction centers turned into that brain. In simple wooden huts or canvas shelters, teams of officers and enlisted men bent over phones, charts, and range tables. They received calls from forward observers who had climbed rocky ridges with their binoculars and radios. The observers sent back precise coordinates. The centers converted those coordinates into firing data for multiple batteries at once. Instead of scattered fire from a few guns, whole groups of artillery could strike one grid square together, with shells arriving almost at the same moment. The technique known as time on target became a centerpiece of this new approach. The idea was deceptively simple. Batteries at different distances from the same target fired at slightly different times so that every shell arrived in the same sudden burst. For the enemy, there would be no slow buildup of incoming rounds, no gentle warning in the form of a few stray shells. One instant the ground would be quiet. The next it would erupt in a synchronized storm of steel and flame. American crews practiced this method again and again until the calculations and commands became as natural as breathing. This was more than a technical improvement. It was a shift in philosophy. Artillery was no longer just a support arm that reacted to infantry needs. It was becoming a decisive tool for shaping the entire battle. Maps in the command posts began to show not only unit positions, but planned concentrations of fire, pre-registered targets, and fallback lines where curtains of shells could be laid down to cover withdrawal or support counterattacks. Every advance and every defensive stand now had an artillery plan woven into it from the start. The tank destroyer forces were changing in parallel. Their doctrine had been born from the fear of mass German armor sweeping across open country. Kasserine had shown that spreading these units thinly along the line turned that fear into a self-fulfilling weakness. In Tunisia, staff officers and field commanders began to rewrite that story. Tank destroyer battalions were treated less like static gatekeepers and more like mobile reserve fists. Instead of being chopped into company-sized chunks and assigned to various divisions, they were kept together as coherent formations. They trained to move rapidly along prepared routes, to use the folds of the land for concealment, and to set up layered ambush positions where enemy tanks would be drawn into overlapping fields of fire. The goal was no longer to have a handful of anti-tank guns everywhere. It was to have a powerful anti-tank cluster somewhere decisive at exactly the right moment. Crews learned to trust new habits. They were taught not to fire at the first glimpse of enemy armor unless the situation demanded it. They learned to hold their fire until multiple enemy vehicles were exposed. They learned to shift positions quickly after shooting, using dust and smoke to cover their movement. They drilled against simulated assaults, sometimes losing, sometimes winning, but always recording and analyzing what had happened. Every mistake became part of a growing body of practical knowledge. Infantry officers watched these changes and adjusted their own thinking. They began to plan their defenses and attacks with a clearer sense of how artillery and tank destroyers could fit into the picture. Instead of asking for vague support, they prepared specific fire missions and anti-tank kill zones in advance. They worked out signals and timings with gunners and tank destroyer commanders. Cooperation that had once been improvised on the spot now became deliberate and rehearsed. Higher-level command also learned from Kasserine in a quieter but equally important way. Eisenhower and his senior staff accepted that honest criticism had to become part of the culture. Reports from the battle were not treated as paperwork to be filed, but as raw material for improvement. After-action reviews dug into the details of who had done what, where, and when. Sloppy reasoning and vague explanations were no longer enough. Officers were expected to understand not only what had happened, but why it had happened, and how it might be done better next time. This atmosphere of self-examination drew the Americans into sharp contrast with their German opponents. The German army had accumulated immense combat experience since the start of the war, and that experience gave them confidence. Yet their system was beginning to strain under the weight of too many fronts and too few resources. The Americans, in contrast, were early in their war, but they stood on a foundation of vast industrial strength and a willingness to learn rapidly from both allies and enemies. British officers shared their own hard-won lessons from years in the desert. Techniques for camouflage, movement at night, use of deception, and coordination between ground and air forces were passed across briefing tables and over shared maps. What had taken the British 3 years to refine in blood and frustration was now being compressed into months for their American partners. The exchange was not always smooth, but the direction was clear. The Allied side was becoming a school where experience flowed in all directions. In training areas behind the front, this new doctrine took on flesh and muscle. Trucks rolled in long columns to simulate large-scale movements. Signal units set up complex networks and then deliberately cut parts of them to test backup plans. Engineers practiced rapid mine laying and clearance to shape the flow of any future battle. Medical units rehearsed evacuation under fire. Each piece of the army was drilled not only in its own tasks but also in the ways it would interact with every other piece. Through all this, the memory of Kasserine sat in the background like a warning flare that never fully faded. No one wanted to repeat the experience of watching German armor punch through uncoordinated defenses. No one wanted to see supporting units acting as isolated islands again. The reforms in artillery and tank destroyer doctrine, the emphasis on honest analysis, the rise of a culture that rewarded adaptability over routine, all of these were, in some way, answers to the questions that Kasserine had silently shouted across the desert. By mid-March, the landscape of the American Corps had changed in ways that would have been hard to imagine only a month earlier. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now clearer planning. Where there had been pride without much experience, there was now a more grounded confidence born from recent hard lessons. Guns were registered, routes were plotted, and contingency plans were written and rewritten until they almost seemed to memorize themselves. Signs of German preparation continued to accumulate. Tracks along distant slopes, new reports from reconnaissance aircraft, intercepted signals that hinted at renewed offensive intentions. Somewhere beyond the hills, the tenacious 10th Panzer Division and its supporting units were preparing their own next move. The stage was being set on both sides of the line. As the sun went down over the Tunisian ridges on another cool evening in March, American artillerymen checked their calculations one last time. Tank destroyer crews inspected their guns and engines with quiet focus. Infantrymen cleaned their rifles and studied the shapes of the ground they had been assigned to hold. The new way of war they had built in a few short weeks was ready to be tested not on a training range, but in the only arena that truly mattered. The next clash would not be a rehearsal. By mid-March 1943, the Tunisian campaign was moving toward a new focus point. The rough hills and dry valleys around a small settlement called El Getter did not look famous. It was a scattering of buildings, groves, and wells set in a long valley flanked by rocky ridges. Yet maps on the tables in Allied headquarters now circled that name again and again. It lay on one of the routes toward the coastal plain where the remaining Axis forces were concentrated. Whoever controlled El Getter would shape the next phase of the battle for Tunisia. George Patton understood this clearly. Under his command, the American corps pushed south and east, feeling for firm ground both literally and figuratively. The advance was not a grand sweeping movement. It was a careful extension of lines, ridge by ridge, wadi by wadi. Units that had been mauled at Kasserine now marched with a more controlled energy. Patrols went out ahead, not just to make contact but to measure distances, count enemy guns, and learn where the land offered good defensive positions. The approach to El Getter gave the Americans something they had lacked during the earlier disaster. It offered a chance to choose ground and prepare it before the enemy launched a major attack. Patton and his staff meant to take full advantage. They were determined that this fight would not be another case of hastily arranged lines and improvised reactions. This time, the enemy would run into a prepared system, tied together by artillery, tank destroyers, and infantry that knew exactly what was expected of them. American units took up positions along the heights and across the valley floor. Infantry dug in on ridges and low hills that overlooked likely avenues of approach. Engineers worked long hours in the hard soil, laying mines in belts designed to slow and canalize enemy armor into killing zones. Artillery batteries chose locations where they could fire with wide arcs yet still remain concealed from direct observation. Tank destroyer battalions were tucked into carefully chosen pockets, placed so they could move quickly to threatened sectors without exposing themselves too early. As the defenses solidified, the new artillery doctrine was folded into every plan. Fire direction centers created detailed fire plans for the terrain around El Getter. They registered targets on crossroads, dry stream beds, likely assembly areas, and the open stretches where tanks would have to cross if they wanted to reach the American lines. Observation posts went up on high ground, connected by wire and radio to the guns in the rear. Officers marked time on target missions on their charts, ready to be triggered the moment German formations revealed themselves. Tank destroyer commanders studied the same ground from a different angle. They looked for places where their guns could see without easily being seen. They walked the paths that enemy tanks might have to take once the minefields forced them inward. They planned ambush positions behind low ridges, among olive groves, and along shallow folds in the valley floor. This time they would not be scattered. Entire battalions would wait as coiled reserves, ready to move as soon as reports from the front pinpointed where the German armor was strongest. The days before the coming battle carried their own rhythm. At dawn the valley around El Getter was often wrapped in cool air and a thin haze, the hills casting long shadows. As the sun climbed, heat shimmered above the rocks and dust. During daylight hours engineers adjusted mine belts, infantry deepened foxholes, and gunners checked their sights and elevation settings. At night the glare of the sun faded, replaced by the muted glow of shielded lamps in command tents and the quiet murmur of radios and field telephones. Inside Patton's headquarters, maps of the El Getter sector grew dense with markings. Arrows showed possible German courses of action. Circles indicated artillery concentrations. Small symbols marked tank destroyer reserve areas and planned movement routes. Officers reviewed these charts repeatedly, looking for gaps, for any piece of ground not tied into the larger defensive system. Each time they found a weak spot, they shifted units, adjusted fire plans, or laid more mines. The intention was simple. The 10th Panzer Division, if it came, would not face a fragmented screen. It would face a dense, layered defense. Intelligence reports confirmed what everyone suspected. The German forces opposite the American lines were still dangerous. The 10th Panzer Division had a hard reputation, built over campaigns in Russia and other fronts. Its crews were experienced, its officers skilled at coordinated attack. They were supported by other units of the Axis army in Tunisia, including German and Italian infantry and artillery. Even with supply difficulties and air pressure from the Allies, These forces retain the ability to deliver sharp blows. Rumors of the impending clash flowed through the American positions like an underground river. Soldiers cleaning their rifles knew that the quiet could not last. Artillery crews who ran drill after drill understood that soon they would be firing not at practice targets, but at real armored columns. Tank destroyer crews listened to the distant rumble of engines on the wind and wondered which of those sounds marked a patrol and which marked the early stages of an attack. British observers watched closely, aware that this battle would reveal whether the rapid American learning curve was real or only an illusion. They had seen armies talk about reform after defeat and then fall back into old habits once the shock faded. Here in Tunisia, however, the Americans had not been given time to relax. The enemy remained near, the next offensive always a possibility. This pressure had forced change to proceed without pause. By late March, the signs of imminent action became impossible to miss. Patrols reported increased German activity beyond the ridges. Tracks of tanks and trucks marked the hard soil in widening patterns. Occasional artillery shells landed near forward positions, not as part of a full bombardment but as probing shots, range tests, and reminders that the enemy was watching. Overhead, Allied reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that showed vehicles concentrating in areas behind the front, concealed as best they could be under nets and in wadis. On the evening before the main clash, El Getter settled into a tense stillness. The sun slid down behind the hills, turning the sky over Tunisia into bands of orange and deepening blue. In the valley, American infantry checked their weapons one more time and filled their canteens. Artillerymen laid out their ammunition in ready stacks, labeling the boxes for quick selection. Tank destroyer crews sat on the hulls of their vehicles for a few quiet moments before returning to final inspections of guns, engines, and radios. In the command posts, final briefings moved from map tables to field telephones. Unit leaders reviewed their instructions. They knew where they were to stand fast, where they were allowed to bend, and where counterattacks might be launched if the enemy broke through the outer edges of the mine belts. They knew which artillery concentrations could be called down on specific lines of advance. They knew how to summon tank destroyer reserves with clear, simple messages. The night was short. Before first light, drivers started engines with muted care, letting them idle so vehicles would be ready to move at a moment's notice. Forward observers climbed to their chosen spots in the darkness so they could be in place when dawn revealed the valley floor. Signalers checked each line, each radio net, confirming once again that the web tying the corps together remained intact. As the eastern sky began to pale, figures on the American ridges looked out toward the horizon. The first shapes appeared as smudges, then as clearer outlines of armored vehicles and supporting troops. German units were moving, columns forming, armor aligning for the thrust toward El Getter. Dust rose slowly behind them like a growing cloud. Somewhere among those vehicles rolled the tanks of the 10th Panzer Division, the same kind of force that had punched through American lines at Kasserine. Now it was heading toward a different kind of defense, one forged from defeat, rebuilt with urgency, and wired together by a new doctrine of fire and movement. The valley around El Getter was about to become the testing ground for everything the Americans had learned in 27 days of relentless change.